Has it started yet? Recording pending. All right. Hi everyone. Today, Griffin is giving a talk on Problem of Democracy. I'm glad to see you all here, and yeah, without any further ado, over to Griffin.
Right, so yes, as Matt has said, the problem with democracy and what we should do to fix it. So democracy is a system of government by the whole population or all the eligible members of a state, typically through elected representatives. The UK is a parliamentary constitutional monarchy, so that's kind of two things combined. So constitutional monarchy is where the sovereign, which is our queen, has to act in accordance with the constitution, and in our case, the constitution is an unwritten one. And in the UK, obviously, the monarch's basically ceremonial now, and she has no power essentially. And it's parliamentary because the powers that sovereign used to have are now invested into the head of state and legislature. And then most of the Western world fall into a couple more. So there's a full presidential republic, which is a form of government in which the head of state leads an executive branch that is separate from the legislative branch, like the United States, and semi-presidential republics, which is where a president exists alongside a prime minister, which is like what Russia's supposed to be. So some of the main problems, by the way, that poster is a anti-democratic one from the Soviet Union, which is pretty cool. But yeah, the three main reasons I think democracy is fully flawed are voters are not well enough informed to be effective in deciding their leader, focus solely on the needs of the majority, and it's an inefficient system in both organizationally and in terms of how short-lived a kind of governing body is. So I'm going to go over them all. So Jason Brennan is an American philosopher, and he states that less than 30% of Americans can name two or more of the rights listed on the First Amendment of the Bill of Rights. So the problem is that an ignorant vote is worth the same amount as an informed vote. And if one wants to be informed, they have to have an extensive knowledge of a candidate's past and present political beliefs, and also read around the subject a bit. And people fall into two main categories in terms of their ignorance. The first is rationally ignorant. So rational ignorance is basically people are logical for not staying informed of politics because it takes too much time, or it costs too much, or they don't have a good enough education. So it's basically like they can't control the fact that they don't know enough about politics. So therefore it's rational ignorance. Then there's rational irrationality, which is quite similar, but it's basically where you have a set of like beliefs which are irrational. So say you think that all people aged 18 should be killed or something because that's like your religion, and you don't have the ability to educate yourself and realize that what you believe is complete crap. So it's similar because you're still in a position where you can't do much about it. So you're still uninformed, but it's based on irrational beliefs. And even if people could do it, it's not worth it on a cost-benefit analysis because a single vote is worth nothing essentially, and your vote's not going to be the deciding vote in basically any election. So it's not worth informed and then not make a difference in the grand scheme of things. So next is representation, and I'm quoting it from Robert A. Dahl here. He defines democracy as a system of governments that respond nearly fully to each and every one of their citizens. However, he believes that today no such system actually does exist. There are partial democracies, so there's a scale of how democratic a country is. A country isn't just democratic or not democratic. And he believes that we should be pushing towards like democratizing countries. The only way that this actually happens at the moment is in polyarchy, which means the rule of the many people. And countries that claim to have switched to a democracy most likely have just switched to a polyarchy, whereas it might not actually be a democracy because it doesn't actually serve the needs of every single person. And he thinks that in order to democratize a country to its fullest extent, polyarchy needs to be implemented at a national level. And then the democratization process needs to begin at a subnational level, so like regional councils, stuff like that. And then finally, the third main reason is inefficiency. So coalition governments are generally really bad because they're formed after elections, so there's no real like ideological concurrence between the parties in the coalition. I mean, they might be like kind of, these are like the left-wing parties, but they all have different manifestos and different objectives, so they won't get much done anyway. And then they're all going to have aspirations, and it's very easy for a coalition to break up before the next election, and no decision can be made again. And furthermore, there are these economists, Meltzer and Richard, and they argue by median voter theorem, which is basically people in the middle, like in terms of their wealth and so on, have the most power in their vote because they kind of fall into the middle category. So they're like the balancing. So whichever way they sway is likely to determine the outcome of the election. And this basically means marginalized groups are not served for, thus not represented. And this means that the median voter might not care about marginalized groups. So people could go oppressed, and even if it's a democracy, the voices still aren't heard because they don't have the casting, they don't have the power. So that brings me on to the 2000 US presidential election, which is a very good case study for seeing how democracy has failed. I'll give you a brief overview. November 7th, George Bush is polling ahead of Al Gore. But through the night of November 8th, they keep flipping in terms of how networks think they'll win and how much they're actually winning by. And by the end of the night, the state of Florida, which is the deciding state of the election, is uncalled. And basically, the next couple of months, the election was just decided through court cases. And a person of particular interest, I'll mention her soon, Katherine Harris, she had big power in this. And you'll see why it's extremely undemocratic. But essentially, the court process decided the election. And even though Al Gore had 500,000 more votes, it just came down to who had the most political power in Washington. So there were three main problems in 2000. Multiply ballots were the first one. So usability of a ballot design. There were many voters who did not understand it or could not actually vote because it was too complicated, which meant that there were thousands of votes that were left uncounted by voting machines because people were either voting for too many, which is overvote, or not voting for anyone, undervote. So Katherine Harris, she basically was the Secretary of State for Florida, and she held that the recounting process should be halted. And it went through court, and eventually she actually won the case. But the problem was that she was actually the co-chair of George Bush's election team in Florida. So you can kind of see why someone who's supposed to be an unbiased representative was actually not in that case. And then Ralph Nader. Ralph Nader is quite an interesting person because basically he did very well for the third party, and that meant that a lot of Gore supporters actually thought that he spoiled the election, and there was a big controversy about it. But to be fair to him, in one of the exit polls done on Florida voters, it's actually found that Bush would have led Gore by a point if Ralph Nader hadn't actually run in the race, so people have just used him as kind of a scapegoat to blame him for Gore's electoral loss. Anyway, there are some alternatives to representative democracy. So firstly, I'll go over direct democracy, which is the form of democracy in which people decide on policy initiatives directly. Right. So there's no intermission. And then the democratic process might entail executive decisions, making laws, dismissing officials, or conducting trials. So it's basically a direct relationship between the people and decision making. The two leading forms are participatory democracy, which basically emphasizes that everyone should get involved in the democratic process. So everyone should roll up to the town square and cast their vote. And deliberative democracy, where it adopts consensus voting and majority rules. So it's a bit representative, but it's still a direct relationship between the voter and the democratic process. A good example is in Switzerland, the cantons of Switzerland, and it works really well there because they have a federal structure of government, meaning the cantons in Switzerland have a lot of power to self-govern. This makes it easier for direct democracy to take place because you only have a few thousand people making decisions rather than the whole country having to do it, which is why people argue that it couldn't happen in the United States because it's so big. Basically, citizens will vote around 4 times a year on a range of issues. They actually decide what they can vote on. And it's really easy to hold the government accountable because there's no like middleman. You know what you wanted to do. If that doesn't happen, then you can hold the people you voted in accountable and then decide what you should do based on that. Oh, oops. Let me go back. Right. But there's a problem that continuous voting means that nothing actually gets decided on because people say, oh, we want to make abortion legal. And then some people say, oh, can we have a referendum on why abortion should be illegal? And then it keeps flipping back. And then because it's such a contentious issue, it never actually like settles in one place. And also, voter kind of number of people voting would drop because direct democracy takes a lot more time because you actually have to go and have a like public debate with people to actually reach consensus rather than just like ticking a box. So it means that people have better things to do, will just not vote. And also controversial issues may result in like violence because you're all standing there. If you think if there's something that's happened that's extremely controversial, there easily riots could break out between two opposing factions. So it kind of depends on people to calmly reach a consensus to actually work out. So basically on the other side of the scale to direct democracy is democratic centralism. And it's quite authoritarian. It's mainly associated with Lenin, where basically the political vanguard party made up of the professional revolutionaries, they practice this system in order to elect leaders and officers and to determine policy. But actually it has been used by several social democratic parties, which is like barely center-left. So they propose a motion, and then after a period of debate, a vote is taken. If a single vote is obviously the winner, then all of the members in the vote have to commit to that idea and not use propaganda against it or try and work towards what they thought was best. They all have to work together. And essentially, the Bolsheviks just defined it in 4 main points. That all directing bodies of the party from top to bottom shall be elected. That party bodies shall give periodical accounts of their activities to their respective party organizations. That there should be strict party discipline and the subordination of the minority to the majority. That all decisions of high bodies shall be absolutely binding on lower bodies and all party members. It's the clear advantage to this system is that it's extremely effective, because countries can effectively direct resources to certain projects. So say they want to build a dam, there's no like people trying to divert resources away, because they're all deciding that's what we're going to do. It's also seen to be quite unionizing, because you have like a single vision, and if you get rid of the kind of the alternates projects almost, then you can unify the people behind one goal. However, the system does have major flaws. Basically, you can just look at the Soviet Union under Stalin, where basically the Supreme Soviet did little more than just approve what Stalin said. And it also spread to their elections. Basically, you had a list of candidates who were unopposed because they had already been chosen in the position, and they would win like 90% of the vote. And even worse, in some countries, if you didn't vote for the candidate you knew was going to win, you still would get punished because you weren't behind that candidate. And finally is monitory democracy. And it's contended that it is actually a different type of democracy, or if it's just like a description of a perfect democracy and very hypothetical. But it's theorized by an Australian professor, John Keane, and the monitory institutions refer to watchdog and guide dog bodies, which subject governments to a public mechanism of checks and balances. And in theory, these extend to the ideas around representative democracy, and it means that more citizens are actually involved in the political process because it's a lot more transparent, and they're less ignorant because they actually know what the government's doing. He also argues that democracies over time have actually become monetary, some of them, and that there's like a distinction between the democracies of throughout the 20th century and modern day ones, because of what governments could do is secretly, and now because we have bodies which make sure that they don't do anything stupid, that they're monetary democracies now. He also thinks that technological shifts have increased the demand for factual-based power monitoring. And I probably tend to agree with him there, because you have things like the internet, which have hugely helped, seeing exactly what people have done, because it's a huge public records, whereas in the past, you could just burn records. But yeah, the main criticisms is that it's quite new, and it seems to forget the existing hierarchical structure of democracy. So John Keane basically just pretends that there isn't actually a system in place, and he says, "Oh, this is the system we should have," without like explaining how it would actually change into his version of monetary democracy. So it's kind of contended how he would actually go about it, and like once he actually, I mean, it overlooks certain aspects of democracy, and it's very hypothetical and idealistic. So what should we do? These are some questions I posed to you. Should we change this current democratic process? If so, is that even an option anymore? And what democratic process is best to follow? And yeah, any questions?
So just say thank you, Griffin, and now's the time for any questions. So chat, or you can raise your hands and Griffin can answer if you unmute yourselves. So yeah.
How do I answer questions? Oh, right. Do you think direct democracy could work if digital voting was implemented? And do you think online voting could be the future? Okay, so there are two questions there. Firstly, I do think direct democracy could work digitally. There's always contended about, you see like alt-right outlets say, oh, the voting machines can be hacked, but pretty much every democratic process has a flaw. I mean, I outlined that in the 2000 election. The butterfly ballots were just idiotic. The fact that you vote and then you punch your whole card and then the child doesn't fully pull out and then that decides an election is stupid. So I think in the future, as we build up kind of cybersecurity, digital voting will take over. And yeah, I do see it in the future happening. I think it'll take a long time though before we can actually get to a secure state. And it'll also be quite hard to convince people that it's better than the system we have in place. Zach asked, completely honestly, do you think Gore won 2000? Was it so? Completely honestly, I do think he won because the margin was about 1,000 votes in Florida without the so if the recount had happened, he probably would have won. That's theorized. The reason the recount actually didn't happen is because I think it was like Equal Protection Voting Act or something, 14th Amendment, and it basically meant that you couldn't do specific recounts in certain counties. And so I think that was fair, but then the Supreme Court said you can't do any other version of recounting because it'd be too late. So they basically just said it doesn't matter. He's the president because we've run out of time. And it wasn't a stolen election. People who claim that Ralph Nader stole the election, basically they're wrong. And even if he did, it's not stolen election because. Oh wait. I don't know what you mean by stolen. If you mean that the third-party candidate meant that it was unfair, or you meant that Catherine Harris actually stole it. But in both cases, I don't agree that Ralph Nader did, but I do agree that the fact that Catherine Harris was on the electoral team for Bush and also the Secretary of State for Florida was a very funny coincidence. Right. Do you think we should abolish the monarchy and all House of Lords? I don't think we should abolish the monarchy because they are very useful diplomatically. And it's actually a real advantage that we have a queen because she's an unbiased representative of the country. And I think that'll actually be quite useful for the next 4 years because Biden and Boris don't seem to get along too well. But the queen can just act as like a middle ground and it's quite useful to represent us. And House of Lords, I think, probably, yeah, it should be reformed heavily. I agree with what Gordon Brown said recently. He said that it should turn into like a regional council or something of like the different areas of the UK. Because that would mean that there's more, what do you call them? More power devolved into the certain areas in the north and so on. So it would mean that less like fake Tory projects like Northern Powerhouse would actually get through. And I think it'd be fairer and better for equality in general. Nils asks, how can you convince people that using voting machines is secure when the consensus in the security community is that they're not secure? Well, I'm not going to pretend I know a lot about the security of it, but I do think that if you're looking at it comparatively, the fact that it hypothetically, like, it's easy to corrupt any form of voting. Like you can, even though it wasn't malicious, the butterfly ballots used in the 2000 election was still like completely stupid in every way. I mean, it was actually brought in by Democrats. So it wasn't some ploy by the Republicans to get Democrats to vote for Pat Buchanan. It's basically, it's so easy to get wrong and have a huge impact. So I think maybe aspirationally, we could hope that in the future security systems would be in place so that online voting would be better. But I don't know. All I know is that in-person voting is very easy to mess up. Zach, I think I said, yeah, I do think Bush stole the election because of, I mean, also his brother, Jeb Bush, was literally the governor of Florida. I mean, you don't get more special interest for Bush to win Florida than that. Maybe a Dutch system monarchy. I'm not sure. Isn't the Dutch system just like even more like just diplomatic and just have literally no power? But I'm not sure too much about it. Why would you abolish the Queen? I would not abolish the Queen. I think you're talking to Zach though. Mr. Greenwood asks, how would you deal with the disenfranchised whose vote does not count? I have never elected anyone with my vote. Is this democracy? I think I don't know how I would do it. I think idealistically, I would say that having benevolent rulers would work. But if I was being pragmatic, I'd probably say some version of direct democracy, because if you have like a meeting with everyone, and assuming everyone's able to like go to this meeting, you'll see the marginalized groups and they can actually raise their voice. Whereas just on a ballot, it's impossible for them to do that because no one ever sees, like, no one cares really how this community votes for, like, the middle voter, the people who have the most power. So I'd probably say that. Also, maybe having it more regional or I've gone federal system. If the UK was a bit more federal, it would at least mean that people who, like, where the spatial inequality is in the UK, where so you'll have like a mining town which has a high unemployment rate. If they had more power to govern themselves, maybe they could solve some of the issues that London can't fix for them. What do I think federations, that they're more or less efficient? I think I'm not too fond of the idea of federations in terms of efficiency, because I think that having like the kind of ultimate government is really useful because they're quite good at keeping the country running. Because obviously you couldn't have like every postcode has their own micronation. Just use an extreme example because nothing would ever happen. So I think it's about finding a balance so that the country can act as a whole, but at the same time, you're not seeing like it was something like I can't remember the stat, but the majority of investment in the UK ends up in London, and I think if kind of counties had more power, then they could say, "Oh, we would like to see 5% of that investment." Do you think democracy can really work under hypercapitalism? I mean, I don't think democracy works now. As I've mentioned, I think under hypercapitalism, it's only going to get worse because it will just further the divide between the rich and poor. There'll be the people who are marginalized there'll be more marginalized people. And I think it'll be even harder for a governing body, especially representative democracy, to actually represent the whole people. And it'll probably just be minimized to like basically 50% of people are represented, and then the others are just totally unaccountable. I think it'll just be stretched to that extent. Do I think there'll be an Indie Ref 2? Is that this? If that's a Scottish one, then I think no. I think that's a Scottish one. No, basically because definitely not at the moment. The Tories have a majority. Labour won't want to do it because they will not win an election in decades if they do so, because with Scotland gone, that's chances of coalition completely gone. Labour just will not win a general election if Scotland are there, or at least it'll take years for the demographics of the UK to change in order for Labour to win. So I don't think Labour will be very fond of it. They'll have maximum one term where they say, oh, let's form a coalition. You can have your referendum. If you win, then there's the Scottish vote gone. And the Tories have been pretty clear that they don't actually want to see Scotland leaving, and they can always just bring up the stupid, oh, they said that they already said they didn't want to leave. Now what will they do? And also, it's unclear whether Scotland will actually be able to join the EU if they leave the UK. And I'll put them in, won't put them in a dire situation, but it won't be best for their short-term economic growth. Right.
All right. I think that's it. And like